I think I'm just going to, this podcast is just me being put in my place. I think that's.
There was a brief praise Michael moment.
It was. Yeah. It did happen.
It didn't last long.
We're gonna praise him like we should. Well, we had an unexpected storm, so it's very humid and muggy today. So that's been great for the old hair sitch. Right, are we ready?
Yes.
Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of the podcast series Heart of the Matter. This is our podcast series about hearts in health humanities. Today, we're going to chat about a recent article published by 2 of our founders, Claire Hansen of JCU and Michael Stevens of UNSW. So we're going to find out a lot more about heartbeats, which is good because that keeps us going. So Claire and Michael, tell us a little bit about this work and how you got into combining Shakespeare and artificial hearts. I'm still making the leap here, so enlighten me.
It's a great question, Breed, and it really is an unexpected combination, right? It all kind of started because Claire invited me to give a talk on artificial hearts at her university a couple of years ago. I had a great time, and I did what I thought was a really great presentation about the history of artificial hearts and how they've evolved over the last 50 years. You know, starting with these really large, bulky pulsatile devices that really only fit in a small handful of people, to where they are today, which are these really, really tiny, small turbines that can be implanted in tens of thousands of different people. During the post-talk discussion and afterwards, we were thinking about how people with these artificial hearts came to terms with no longer having a discernible heartbeat, which is one of the side effects of having one of these really tiny turbines implanted inside you, given our medical and cultural understandings of the pulse as a key sign of life.
Yeah, it struck us as a really interesting dilemma, especially given centuries of literature and culture that uses the symbol of not only the heart, but the heartbeat specifically. As a Shakespeare scholar, I, of course, turned to familiar territory. I turned to Shakespeare to find examples, and he serves as a pretty useful cultural barometer. And in his works, I found some intriguing uses of heartbeat references across the plays.
So when we started putting together research into our respective areas, we didn't really know where the article was going to end up. But we started putting together research in artificial hearts, identity, and hearts in Shakespeare. And we realized that there's some fundamental connections here that can really help to better conceptualize the patient experience.
And that is absolutely fascinating, Michael. And I know you're going to tell us a little bit more about how that worked out in the paper for you. But before we go any further, I would like you to give us a little bit of an intro into the artificial heart scenario there, for those of us who have no clue what you're on about.
Sure, absolutely. So, we all know that heart failure is very prevalent in our society and in the developed world. For people who've got heart failure, the best treatment for them is a heart transplant, but there's simply just not enough heart transplants to go around. There's a massive discrepancy between supply and demand. And so if you're waiting for a heart transplant, there's a high likelihood that you may not make it to see your donor heart. For those people, an artificial heart is like a godsend. It's a mechanical device that can, assist or completely replace a failed heart in its one job, which is to pump blood around the body. So like the early artificial hearts, as I mentioned earlier, were these big pulsatile, basically balloons inside this PVC casing, and it was designed to mimic how the native heart operated. It would kind of relax and contract and squish blood and pulse it around the body. The problem is evolution has about 2 million years head start on heartbeats than engineers. And so we were never able to make something that could last a very long time without damaging blood cells or anything like that. So, the modern artificial hearts these days, we call them left ventricular assist devices, or LVADs. And the clue's in the name. They're devices that will assist a patient's left ventricle, which is the main chamber of the heart, to pump blood around the body. And, they're little turbines, the smallest one's smaller enough to fit in the palm of your hand. And it's the same technology that's used in pool filters or aquariums to just kind of push blood through in a continuous manner, kind of like flow going through a garden hose. So these people can now receive an LVAD while they're waiting for a heart transplant. But one of the downsides of that is that they don't have a pulse anymore. Blood is no longer being pushed around in little sequential pulses. It's going through in a continuous stream, like I said, like flow through a garden hose. And that's kind of where Claire and I started looking at this link between pulselessness and Shakespeare.
Okay, so that's been fantastically illuminating, Michael. So I can fully grasp the pool filter system. Perhaps not my husband sorts the pool, but I definitely can understand the garden hose analogy. So Claire, can you tell us how on earth you've managed to connect this to Shakespeare?
Yes, I can try. Well, it always, every time I hear the sort of description of the evolution of the LVAD, I'm always sort of struck by how amazing that is. And then this very, very mundane, down-to-earth comparison with pool filters and garden hoses, it gets me every time. Well, yeah, moving away from then the garden hoses, not too much of that in Shakespeare, but spoiler for a little bit later in today's podcast, Shakespeare did kind of preempt a living pulseless heart. But more broadly, of course, we have centuries old understandings about our bodies, ourselves, and Shakespeare was one of our cultural figures who articulated and continues to perpetuate many of these in very powerful ways. The heart as both a symbol and a vital organ, and it's important to think of it in those at least two key ways. The heart illuminates beliefs about ourselves, historically, culturally, medically, physically. And we can see this at work in Shakespeare in these multiple ways. So the heart is operating in diverse ways across Shakespeare's corpus. Over the centuries, these ideas are reused and reimagined, extended, and of course, are still critically relevant for us today. So despite working with a 400-year-old author and his texts, those ideas permeate our culture continually. As Marjorie Garber has said, Shakespeare makes modern culture. And I think this is a nice example of that. So Shakespeare's discourse continues to pervade our modern language, and the heart is an example of that. He gives us representations of the heart, the pulse, and most importantly, for this discussion today and for our article, pulselessness. I guess a very long-winded way of saying that, how on earth is this connected to Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare gives us a way of talking about the heartbeat and the pulse and pulselessness that can help us to better understand contemporary experiences of the heartbeat and the loss of that heartbeat through a contemporary device like the LVAD. So through examining representations of the literal and metaphorical pulse and pulselessness in Shakespeare's canon, we can start to interrogate the development of our own understandings of the heartbeat in contemporary medicine and contemporary culture, and ramifications for this at a time when the pulse, as Michael has explained, is no longer always necessary for life.
Wow. So I think that is a big concept to get our heads around, the fact that the pulse is no longer always necessary for life. So I think even if we take that away, that's a very exciting concept from today's podcast. But I'd like to find out more about how this played out for you both. So Michael, can you tell me a little bit more about the process of working in such, a fantastically interdisciplinary way? It's not very often that you see the biomedical engineering working closely with literary studies. So I find that fascinating about this work that you both have been doing.
Yeah, you're right, Breed. Like, it's certainly not something you would see every day, this kind of interdisciplinary link between biomedical engineering and literature studies and humanities. I think it's really awesome and really unique. I learned a lot in this process. I think the two disciplines conduct research similarly, but with some key differences. I think the biggest one is the word limit on journal articles. I think as engineers and in some respects, we are trained a little bit in science, and we're trained to just write as short as possible and concisely as possible. And you're not left any room to kind of make the writing interesting or exciting. And I think something that I've learnt in this process is that it's particularly in the humanities side of things, it's very important to weave and construct an argument and make this beautiful kind of full narrative through the research, which is something that probably is, I guess it's there in scientific and engineering research, but it's a bit plain and a bit boring. And I've learned so much about, well, if we start to contextualize our scientific breakthroughs, engineering breakthroughs in the humanities, in the histories, it becomes such an interesting read and an interesting experience. So
I think it's not boring. Perhaps it's more muted and directed to the point. Whereas in literary studies, and I think I'm possibly quoting Shakespeare again, we do like to wax lyrical.
I think that sums it up perfectly. You're right. It's definitely more muted and to the point response in science and engineering. Breed, I'm really kind of a bit more interested to hear what your thoughts about this are. I know you've got all sorts of knowledge about early modern hearts, and I know today you're kind of playing the role of the intrepid interviewer today, but could you give us a little bit of your background or insight for our listeners to give them a bit more context?
Well, fabulous. I'm always happy to talk, you know that. So I'm happy to share some of my thinking around the heart. So we all know that the heart is a very common symbol, image, metaphor in all of Shakespeare's plays. The researcher William E. Slights, he counts over 1,400 references to the heart across Shakespeare's works. So that is a phenomenal amount of mentions. And if you're clicking on each one of those as you go through his work, it's a lot of clicks. So what has happened today is we have inherited a vast amount of Shakespeare's phrases that we still use around the heart. So, you know, we'll tell people to take heart, and this comes from Antony and Cleopatra. And in Hamlet, we are talking with all my heart. And in Othello, he wears his heart upon his sleeve. And another, I was going to say popular cultural reference, but I think I might be dating myself. But in a couple of decades ago, we used to talk about poster boys as heartthrobs, which comes from Shakespeare as well. So, you know, plenty of room for people to make some judgments on my background there, work away. So the early modern heart is intimately connected to the emotions, as Shakespeare's culture saw the relationship between the physiological and the psychological, emotional realms. They were fundamentally intertwined. So I think this is very important for us today, because we're actually coming back around to those ideas. So if we go back to Shakespeare, we can uncover a wealth of ways of thinking about those concepts and how they're intertwined. So I'm just going to bring Claire back into the conversation here. And Claire, you turned to one of Shakespeare's most well-known plays, Romeo and Juliet, to source examples of pulselessness. So I was going to say, how did you manage to ruin the romance and make it all about heartbeats? But I feel Shakespeare had a hand in ruining the romance in the play as we know it anyway.
Yes.
Do tell us about the heartbeat.
I don't think I can take all the blame for that. And I mean, you actually don't have to try too hard, really. I mean, as the plot kind of heads towards that tragic finale, really Juliet's storyline becomes all about the pulse. She takes a special potion from Friar Lawrence, who, for those of you who remember, is firmly on team Romeo and Juliet. He is the one who secretly marries them. And that potion is designed to stop her heartbeat, but keep her alive for a couple of days, allowing Romeo and Juliet to reconnect and escape for their happy ending. If we look back to the text, Friar Lawrence actually tells her, you know, tomorrow night, get yourself alone, don't let anyone be with you, take this vial. He gives her the potion and explains to her how it's going to work. He says, for no pulse shall keep his native progress but surcease, but she will still be alive. It's quite incredible, really. And I mean, of course, I was familiar with the play before kind of coming to these ideas, but looking at this through the lens of what I've learned from Michael about the LVAD, about the artificial heart, keeping humans alive today without a discernible pulse, and then reading Lawrence's instructions to Juliet and this description of a medicine which can do exactly the same thing, it was kind of astounding to me, really. So Juliet chooses pulselessness as a way to get what she wants. So it's an astonishing bid for freedom, really. It's her remedy, a word that actually gets bandied about a bit at this time of the play. It's referred to as a remedy. So there is kind of like medical language around this decision. But I mean, of course, unfortunately, it doesn't turn out too well. Romeo isn't in on this. And so he reads her lack of pulse, her missing heartbeat, as indicating that she's dead, when actually she is like LVAD patients using pulselessness as a way to get what she needs out of a difficult situation.
Yeah, and Juliet's use of pulselessness is, as like Claire said, it's really similar to what pulselessness offers LVAD patients. These artificial hearts are a route for these patients to health and freedom. A lot of these patients, they're discharged from hospital, they get to go home and live normal lives. The longest treatment, I think, or longest duration of an artificial heart in a patient has been over a decade. So wow. That patient's gone from being on a wait list for a heart transplant with a high mortality to being sent home and getting an extra 10 years on their life, which is pretty special. But it's 10 years without a pulse, And he's not just, that person's not the only case. Patients talk about the ways that LVADs enable them to live their lives more free of constraints that serious life-threatening heart disease presents them.
So there are kind of interesting similarities here in how living pulselessness offers a route to a different kind of life and a different future, really. So in Romeo and Juliet, it's a literal and symbolic way for Juliet to control her body, control her sense of self, and make plans for a future which wouldn't otherwise be possible for her.
Except it doesn't actually end that well for Juliet in this case.
Look, the outcome wasn't that great.
No, but the role of the pulse is still critical to the narrative and fascinating.
Absolutely. We will grant you that it is an absolutely fantastic and fascinating topic. But for those of you listening or watching this podcast, for more on this, you can check out Michael and Claire's article. It's in the journal Medical Humanities, volume 47, which was published this year, 2021. So we'll be chatting about more fascinating recent research on hearts in the health humanities in our next podcast. So do join us next time.